The following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Access Television, the City of Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Cable Television Advisory Commission, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Eye on Oshkosh. I'm Cheryl Hentz along with my co-host Tony Palmeri. On this edition we're going to be talking about something probably everybody's favorite subject. It's taxes. Nobody likes to pay them. Everybody talks about them and complains about them. And right now there is legislation that is pending. It's moving through our state legislature and so forth. It's called the Taxpayer Protection Act. And we're joined by two people tonight who are going to discuss this issue with us and try and help us make some sense of it. Certainly last year, Governor Doyle put forth a levy freeze, and that has caused many of us to see fees increased, some new fees put on the books. We're going to find out what this will do, if it means more fees or not. Joining us to my right is Winnebago County Executive Mark Harris, familiar to my left. I don't even know my directions here. To my left is County Executive Mark Harris, familiar face to most of you. And to his left is Joan Hansen, Tax Policy Advisor for Americans for Prosperity, the Wisconsin chapter. That group is strongly advocating this measure, and Mark, of course, is opposed to it. So I want to thank both of you for being here tonight, and we're going to jump right into this. I guess the first place I'd like to start is, this Taxpayer Protection Act. We've just begun hearing a little bit about this. What we heard about for some time was Tabor, and I think that Tabor probably started with something else. Joan, why don't you kind of give us a brief history of
Sure, thank you.
Where we started and how we got to this point.
Let me just quickly describe how this started. This actually started in California in the 1970s, the first Proposition 1, and it's a tax, it started out as tax or spending limits on the restraint of government, to restrain government. And from there, it turned into different states trying to adopt these tax or spending limits on government. And I think in Wisconsin, where we started on this, before Tabor, which we heard about first, we started this probably 10 to 15 years ago with Senator Welch trying to get some constitutional changes to say you need 2/3 of a vote to raise taxes. And from there you started to see Colorado adopt Tabor. And then thus Wisconsin called their first version of it Tabor that Frank Lassay introduced. And from there, this session we introduced a Taxpayer Protection Amendment, which is significantly different than Tabor in that it is a revenue restraint and not a spending restraint. But what it is, it's an overall cap on how much revenues can be raised at every level of government.
Okay.
Is it true?
No, go ahead.
Is it true that Frank Lassay, who sponsored the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in Wisconsin, he's turned against the Taxpayer Amendment? Is that right?
Yes, I believe he has turned against it, and I think it's unfortunate that he has, because I think what we have before us, like anything that's introduced in the legislature, will not be the final version of the bill. I think what we all have to do, and Frank was a great advocate of this, is step back and look at what is it that we're trying to achieve. Whether it's called Tabor, a Taxpayer Protection Amendment, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and can we produce a reasonable vehicle that achieves the goals of cutting growth in government taxes and spending. And I think it was premature of Representative Lassay to oppose it, because we certainly don't have the final document before us.
Well, he opposed it, I think, because he said that it's not going to control for, say, fee increases right?
Yeah, I believe that is so, but I don't really want to get stuck on what he said, because what was introduced yesterday, I think, was introduced rather quickly, and the author of it said it was not drafted correctly.
Right. Well, what I'm getting at here, Joan, is that it seems like Lassay backed away from it because he thinks it's not stringent enough.
Right.
So your group, Americans for Prosperity, you want to see it more stringent.
We do want to see a meaningful restraint on government.
You would have liked a Colorado type of Tabor.
Well, yes, and let me explain what we have. Why don't I explain to the viewers what it is we have before us? We have, and it's something that Americans for Prosperity supports strongly. What we have before us is it's a cap on taxes that would limit growth to CPI plus growth.
CPI is what?
Inflation plus growth. And there's different types of growth depending on the unit of government that's affected. For example, for municipalities, they use a population growth. They use a 60% growth in new construction. For other units of government, they use enrollment for the school. So you have a pretty tight cap on how much government can grow. And a point I'd like to make is that this government is allowed to grow under this. We're not cutting anything. We're reducing the increases in growth. And it provides a rainy day fund for if you have surpluses. And then at some point, if you start going beyond the surpluses, you have to give back the tax dollars to the taxpayers. And then at the local level, if these restraints are too restrictive, they have the option to go to local referendums to say, I want to spend more for the library or for a new road or something like that. You always have the option to go to your citizens and say, we'd like to spend more money on something for the community.
All right, why don't we ask Mark, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, exactly.
What's wrong with that?
Well, I don't oppose in theory reasonable limitations, and I do think it's important that government not grow its taxes at a rate faster than what the public can afford to pay. And in the current environment, when people's budgets are pinched, we have to be pretty tight. But I do think that in the end, the way this proposal is written, the amount of additional spending that we'll allow will be insufficient for us to continue the services we currently provide. And one of the big distinctions between the Wisconsin Taxpayer Protection Act, some people call it Tabor, and the version that was in Colorado, is that the Colorado version allowed that CPI or inflation index plus population growth times the total expenditures in their budget. I can make the case that we would only get about half that much here in Wisconsin. And if we could focus for a minute on the visual aid I brought in.
Sure.
Yeah, let's go to Mr. Harris's visual aid.
If you notice on there, that's showing where revenues come from for the Winnebago County. And of course, Winnebago County is just one government entity that would be limited by this. The city of Oshkosh would also be limited by it, as well as the school system, the technical colleges and other things. But only about a third of our revenue comes in from our property tax levy. The rest comes in from a variety of sources, licenses and permits, public charges. The largest segment being intergovernmental transfers, the money that the federal government and the state government transfers to the county to provide services. Things like the Medicaid benefits, the money for child support enforcement, foster care funds, all sorts of transfers like that, most of which support the social services. This proposal would not allow us an increase in revenue on all of those wedges of the pie. And if we'll look for a second at the other side, you'll see if I sort this pie out in between those segments that are supported or increased by this Tabor-like provision and those that are not increased by it, you'll find that the ones that are increased by it are only 47.4% of my budget. In other words, only half of my budget would get this inflation and population increase. The other segment of my budget is roughly stagnant because the amount of money provided to the county from the state and federal government in many categories is declining, and in other categories it's just stagnant, like revenue sharing hasn't grown for the city or the county in years and years. What this means is that the amount of money that the Coloradans thought was too tight for them to live within and was causing too much of a strain on their government services was nearly double what would actually be allowed to local governments in Wisconsin the way this proposal was written. To give you an example, if you had a married couple and one spouse makes $60,000 and the other one makes $40,000, if one of those spouses gets a 10% raise, their income hasn't gone up 10%. If it's a $60,000 wage that's gone up 10%, their income's gone up only 6%, $6,000. If it's the $40,000 wage that's gone up 10%, they would get a $4,000 increase, which will only be 4% of the total. If the index of inflation and population growth came out to 4%, and this was applied in Colorado, they would get to increase their total spending by 4%. If the same index was applied to my budget, I would only get a little less than half of that, so I'd only be allowed to increase my spending by 2%.
All right.
So what does that do to our services in Winnebago County? How does this play out then, Mark, or how would it play out in terms that Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer can understand?
Over time, because the revenues flowing into the government would be growing slower than inflation, the government would have to scale back on what it's doing. So that you would gradually see an erosion of services. Now, everybody wouldn't feel this equally. In the county's case, we're the social safety net. So those people who are developmentally disabled, the frail elderly, people that are getting social service benefits, they would feel the pinch the most.
Okay.
All right, let's get
What do you
Joan to
think about
respond
that,
to
Joan?
this. Yeah.
Well, with all due respect to my good friend Mark, what I think Mark is talking about is continuing to have government operate as usual. And that's not what we're talking about. Government has operated as usual for the last 160 years. And to put this in perspective, this is what this debate is about. The debate is about Wisconsin has more units of government than any state in the nation. We have over 3,000 units of government. Wisconsin is more supervised. In other words, we have more county board supervisors per county than any other state in the nation. Our taxes are 5th highest in the nation. Our property taxes are 5th highest in the nation. Our state and local tax burden is 5th highest. Property taxes are 5th. Income taxes are 10th highest. And everybody gets this. We're not talking about draconian cuts. This is what we're talking about in simple terms, in terms of money. According to the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, and they just did a report, had this proposal been in place since 1986, revenues would have doubled. We're not talking about huge cuts and all these scare tactics and things like that.
Well, wait a minute, Joan. Andrew Rashofsky from the La Follette Institute says that if this taxpayers amendment had been enacted 20 years ago, state revenue would have been $5.2 billion lower.
That's absolutely right. It would have been. That's the point. Over 20 years, the taxpayers would have, that's to the increases. Taxpayers, and think that's what 1% of, savings?
If our revenue would have been $5.2 billion lower, that would mean that...
Well, what he's talking about is, revenues still under the cap still would have doubled. But with a cap, it also means that over that same time period, 20 years, taxpayers would have saved $5 billion.
But in saving that tax money, they would have given away a lot. Isn't this where the Colorado analogy is a good one? I mean, Colorado ended up suspending their taxpayer Bill of Rights, correct?
Colorado's tax, and I hate to keep talking about Colorado because this isn't Colorado, and that's why I hate to keep talking about it because this isn't Colorado's, but let me tell you, as long as we're on it, Colorado's, what they call TABOR, has worked exactly how it's supposed to. What they did, they didn't suspend it indefinitely. There were
5 years.
5 years, and it's exactly, what's often lost on this issue is when that vote was up, there was another question on the ballot, and what it shows is that, and one of them failed and one of them was approved. What it shows is that taxpayers are sophisticated and intelligent. And there was one question that asked, and I don't remember the amounts, but it was a large amount, and I believe it was something for infrastructure. Will you fund this? It got turned down by the voters. The other one was, can we suspend I don't think it was suspended, but can we, keep our tax dollars for 5 years and Tabor will go back into effect? That one passed, and that worked exactly like it was supposed to. But let me also bring up a point about Colorado that isn't the same as Wisconsin, and where Wisconsin has gone one step further in being a more positive proposal. In Colorado, they didn't take into account what would happen to local governments' budgets if there was a recession. Ours does. We have sort of a hold harmless type of a provision saying you can never go further down than the previous years, and you can still raise up to the cap. That, takes care of that issue. So that's, in that way, Wisconsin's is much, it's much more solid, and it's much more thought out from an economic development perspective and just from an economics perspective.
So explain to us, Joan, why the majority of mayors, city council members, county executives, county supervisors, you're not saying that they're all big spenders that don't want to control their spending, are you? Why are they all against the taxpayers' protection?
Because they're all big spenders. That's true, and not in this area of the state. I'm teasing, but let me.
Are you serious? You think that the average local official in Wisconsin is?
Well, let's back up a little bit. Let's look at the local officials who do support it. Scott Walker, he represents the biggest county in the state, Milwaukee County. Dan Brackus, another Waukesha County. You have a lot of local officials who do support it. And the point is of course, why would government officials oppose this? Because they don't want to make the hard choices. What this is going to do is, like I said, this isn't draconian cuts, and I also brought something that I'd like to show, and I'm going to segue into it. This is what this is going to force, and this is obviously why public employee unions are lobbying against it. What this is going to force is it's going to force a discussion on what can be cut. Public employees, teachers' unions' benefits are 55% above the national average in Wisconsin. Many public employees don't pay co-pays. I mean, I pay $400 a month for my health insurance. This is going to get at those issues that we can't get at now. It's going to force people to look at having more reasonable, health care plans for the public employees. It's going to get at, waste, fraud, and abuse in government. And there's a bunch of examples, and they've been all over the news. We have the Tom Ament, style pension plans. We have the Greendale example of school district administrators not reimbursing for trips they went on. We're paying for UW professors who are in prison. That's what this is going to get at. We're not going to be cutting police and fire. Government's going to be there to fund these important services. They're going to get the first draw on the dollar, as they should.
Well, let me jump in there for a second, because I think in theory we all want to pay less taxes. I don't think there's anyone in this room who would not want to pay less in taxes. But what has ended up happening already, as I mentioned in the opening of the show, is now here in Oshkosh, starting later this year, we're going to be paying for garbage to be picked up. $10 a month. We're paying higher fees for this, that, and the other, and new fees are being put on the books and taxing basically our budget, our checkbook, our pocketbook. And I understand what you're saying too about teachers' salaries and benefits. They will make the argument that there's, bargaining and mediation and all this, and if you take something away, you have to give something back of equal value, and we get caught in this quagmire, if you will, of nobody really giving, nobody really compromising, and so needless to say, it's the taxpayer who ends up still getting stiffed. And our budgets only go so far. So how, and with additional fees, we're not able to take it off of our income taxes, because it's no longer then on our property tax bill. So how can we accomplish what you guys are trying to do, which I think is a wonderful effort, and still not get it from our local officials in the way of fees? Because I'm sorry, because they're saying that they're going to have to cut police and fire and
right. And fees come under the proposal. I mean, revenue doesn't just include taxes; it includes fees, assessments, taxes, and other things. But let me show you what the other side is doing, just so that you can, and it gets to what your point is this isn't, these aren't going to be draconian cuts, and I wanted to bring out something else.
If you hold it up right
Sure.
in this camera here, they'll be able to pick that up for you.
What's disturbing about this is we are not going to see these draconian cuts, and I think what you're going to see in terms of scare tactics are Wisconsin politicians are playing games with your safety. And
Hold that up if you would, Joan.
Sure.
There we go. And
This is put out by AFSCME, and I think it's completely irresponsible. What they have in here is this proposal will force our communities to slash vital services that keep us safe. And it threatens to gut critical funding for police, firefighters, and homeland security. Now, to put this in perspective, 29 states have some sort of limits on taxes or spending, either in their constitution or in their state laws. And you're not seeing homeland security being threatened. You're not seeing police and firemen. You're not seeing all of the stuff that they're putting out. And these are just reasonable cuts to increases in spending. We're not cutting anything. This is going to force prioritizing government spending. This is going to put torque on the system to force this that isn't forced now. There was another interesting article in the Milwaukee paper about GM and the unions, and that they never wanted to rock the boat and really, fight on these issues and come to good conclusions, and now they're bankrupt. And I thought, this is completely analogous to what's going on here. And they said the reason for it is it's easy to spend, and it's tough to make decisions.
All right, let me back up what Joan is saying, Mark, and I'll get you to respond to this. Mark Block is the director of your organization, and he said, I'll get you to respond to this. He said the Taxpayer Protection Amendment would actually free lawmakers to do what they were hired to do: prioritize and spend hard-earned tax dollars responsibly. He says with a reasonable limit on revenue in place, the TPA would make it easier for lawmakers to make tough choices and think creatively about how to better provide services at less cost to taxpayers instead of abdicating these responsibilities in favor of higher taxes. That's basically what Joan has been saying. So what's wrong with that?
I think that's putting fiscal decisions on autopilot, substituting a mechanism inserted in the Constitution for the representative democracy that this country has. Every politician is elected by the people in his district. With the county board, they've only got about 4,300 people in each of their district. They're readily accessible because they live in those districts. They debate decisions, and they've got to balance out the services that people demand with the amount of taxes they're willing to pay. And that's how the system's built. This is going to displace all judgment with a mechanism built into the Constitution. And for people to suggest, well, look how much tax it would save you, and it wouldn't really amount to much of a cut, I don't think that's realistic. We've seen with the city this year, they added a garbage collection fee, and nobody likes that. I don't like that. I wish they had found a different way of dealing with it. But to suggest that we can cut our taxes and not have to make some meaningful cut somewhere or add some fee is absurd. In the Colorado experience, for instance, people found that they had to pay separate fees if their kids want to participate in sports. One woman had to pay $1,000 in fees for her 3 sons to participate in middle school sports.
And we're already seeing that here. More
that's
fees
exactly
being
what we're seeing.
instituted for different types of books and sports and
there's another thing worth pointing out. The facts have been a little fast and loose. There was a time when Wisconsin was the 5th highest tax state, if you only looked at taxes and didn't look at fees. But because of what's been happening with people shifting to fees with these levy limitations, we're now 13th highest in taxes. If you consider both taxes and fees, Wisconsin is the 23rd highest. The 23rd highest, right in the middle, yet we have the highest quality public education in the nation. We don't have to send our kids to private schools like the public does in many states because the quality of the public school system is so bad. If you look at business taxes, Wisconsin is one of the lowest taxing states on business. I believe we came in about 36th last year. So yes, at one time, if you just looked at taxes and just focused primarily on property taxes, we were the 5th highest state. But that's in part because of what's been going on in Madison as well, how they've pushed things down to us. They push the social services on us, which for the most part actually are a federal mandate on the state government, but the state requires the counties to carry them out. And over time, the support coming from the state for those items has gradually declined as a percentage of the total cost. That's caused our property taxes to go up. Now, mind you, the legislature has acted quickly to limit the property taxes that local government funds itself with, but have they cut the sales tax that they fund themselves with? Have they cut back on the income tax that they fund themselves with? Or have they even cut back on the property tax they charge for the reforestation program? Every one of your property tax bills has a small increment of property tax from the state. And they say, well, we didn't cut our taxes because the real complaint is property taxes. But they take property taxes too, and they didn't cut those. So, you know, I think people have to realize we do have a representative form of government. Republican Party used to support local control. It's working. If I spend too much money, the voters are going to send me a message. If I don't provide them enough service, they're going to send me a message. So I've got to find a balance that's acceptable to them.
Well, Joan, you're shaking your head, so let's get you to jump in here. What do you think?
You know, I would argue that local control is absolutely a good thing, and I'd argue that the state doesn't have much of it anymore, with the state sending 63 cents on the dollar back to local communities. But to get to the representative government perspective, let's look at what we have and the 160 years of what we've been doing, and you know, why not give citizens the opportunity to vote for a cap on government spending? And what I mean is, every time in the history of the state that we've tried to relieve property tax, it's always been we've always implemented some other tax in the name of some other tax relief. And what have we ended up with? We started out with property taxes. You know, when Wisconsin was a territory, then it became a state. Then we were the first state to institute an income tax in the name of cutting property taxes. Well, that doesn't work. We have them both. Then we had the sales tax. Then we instituted the system we have now, which Mark is talking about, where you know, the state sends back 64% of its dollars to local communities, and that was done in the name of property tax relief. Well, what has that really translated to? For every dollar that's sent back to local communities, we as citizens only receive about 30 cents, 32 cents in property tax relief. So my point is why don't we allow the citizens of Wisconsin, this enjoys between 65 and 70% support, why don't we allow citizens for the first time since statehood to say government must operate within a reasonable cap, just like we do with our own budgets. You know, when your electric bills go up, we don't get more money to pay our electric bill. We turn down the heat and put on 2 sweaters. I mean, this is all it is. This is a reasonable cap on government spending. This doesn't take away the legislature's authority to do new things. This is a cap on spending that they have to work within. It forces creativity when looking at anything. When you are forced to come up with new decisions, you're going to come up with new creative ideas and maybe how to
but why, Joan, why does it require amending the Constitution to do this?
Because they've never done it. Because it's never been done in the state legislature. It's never been done. That's my whole point. Have we ever seen government in Wisconsin at any level be restrained? And I have to say, in this part of the state is the best part of the state. And it's true, but it's not typical. I mean, in this part of the state, you know, Oshkosh, Appleton, you know,
right,
Fox
let's
cities.
talk about another part of the state. You remember Waukesha Mayor Cheryl Lombardi? She was the mayor of Waukesha. I think she just left that position, I believe.
Yeah.
And she said, she's against TPA. She said, already under state-mandated spending caps, which keep property tax levy increases to 2% or the value of new construction, Lombardi said Waukesha had to make $400,000 in cuts to public library staff, materials, and programs this year. The city also cut funding for summer youth playground programs by 50%. Carol Lombardi's not a reckless spender, is she?
No, she's not a reckless spender.
Well, she was using that as an argument against TPA. She says with the...
Well, maybe Waukesha County should reduce its county board members and then, you know... well, I guess that's
Well,
the county,
Waukesha,
but
didn't they just elect as mayor a guy who came out against TPA?
they did.
And the person who was for it?
But, you know, that did happen, and I suspected you might ask that. If I was not intimately involved in that race, and I don't know what the dynamics were, but I think maybe something better to look at than that. I mean, that's how it's been spun in the press.
But before we look at something else, how
But-
would you explain Lombardi?
Well, let me finish on this first. The real, the thing to look at there is, let's look across the state and see how many referenda passed. That's more telling on what taxpayers are looking at. Most of them didn't pass.
Right.
That's my point. Most of them did not pass because people are tired of paying high taxes in the state. So I don't know if we can attribute that loss in the city of Waukesha yesterday to TPA. I think it's more appropriate to look at what was on the ballot around the state and on, you know, spending and taxes.
But most of those referenda were for school-related items, correct?
Right, but it's all this. I mean, it's all your tax dollars, and people get that. People understand what they're paying in taxes. People understand that their next door neighbor, who might be a public employee, has way better benefits and you know, health care than they do, and they're footing the bill for it. People get that.
Mark, what do you say to this?
Yeah, you know, it is true that there's many people out there that earn less money than government employees and have lower benefits. But are you saying that government employees have to eventually have the worst pay and the worst benefits? A lot
No,
of
I
these
said
are
they
dirty,
should be
dangerous
comparable.
jobs. We've had 2 highway workers killed this year. Yesterday we had to have the assault team of the sheriffs go into a house where there was a murder-suicide. One of the sheriffs was shot. Luckily, he was wearing the appropriate gear and the helmet deflected the bullet. They are dirty, dangerous jobs, and you want them to be there when they need to be there. The 2 fellows that got killed on 41 recently, they used to go up and down the highway every day removing road debris. You know, you don't think about how many tire treads, how much dangerous debris has to be taken out of the highway every day. If we don't do that and someone gets hurt, they'll say, how unreasonable that you cut the person that saved us from this dangerous situation. Most of the jobs we have are like that. Our county added 6 people in the 10 years prior to my coming on board. 6 positions in 10 years when our population went up 10%. We now, after the cuts, which included sheriff patrol officers, DARE officers, correction officers, long-term care nurses, secretaries, the phone operator. We laid off all those people or removed them from attrition. Those are serious, tough decisions. But if we're put under some arbitrary formula that's in the Constitution and can't be easily changed, it's actually going to cause us to make decisions to fit that formula that may not match the goals of our local people. I think our local people do support their schools. I think they do support their sheriff and their police department. I think they do want the fire department to be there when they need them. And this is actually taking it away from their hands and putting it in the hands of people that don't come from this area. This is giving that decision to assemblymen and senators from La Crosse and Milwaukee and Superior, instead of leaving the local people to decide what's the appropriate level of services and taxes that they want to reach a balance on.
Mark, you had mentioned that if this becomes part of our Constitution, it can't be easily changed, and I think that's no doubt true. What would it take, Joan, to change this if it became part of our Constitution?
The way that the process works is that the constitutional amendment, it's not a bill, it must pass the legislature, the exact same version of it, in 2 consecutive sessions, and then the governor doesn't act on it as he would a piece of legislation, so he doesn't sign or veto it, and then it goes on the ballot for voters to decide whether or not they do or don't want some reasonable caps. And with what Mark said, of course I am not suggesting that we should have the worst pay and the worst benefits. I didn't say anything like that. I'm saying there should be some torque on the system where these decisions can be discussed and can be looked at, because as in the GM situation, it's easy to keep spending and everybody wants to like each other and everybody wants to fund everything, but not everything is you know, a good idea to just continue funding. And this is going to force the question of looking at these issues. And I would bet, you know, my next 20 years' salary that the first things that are, of course, going to be funded are things for public safety, firemen, policemen, and for those who are most, you know, at risk in the community, as government, you know, should be. So,
but Joan, here in Oshkosh, the city council put in place a garbage fee. Very unpopular. We just had an election on Tuesday. The candidate who finished #1 was the person who was most against that fee. Isn't that the way to solve spending you don't like at the local level? If we don't like the way Harris is spending, we just vote him out. Why do we need a constitutional amendment to control his spending, when if we don't like his spending, we just get rid of him?
Because it hasn't happened. When has that happened? That happens every time there's an election. 99% of incumbents get reelected. That's not happening. And my counter to that is, why not, for once in 160 years, allow voters to go to the poll and say, you know, and this goes to something else Mark said, we want some sort of restraint on government. This isn't some arbitrary restraint, as Mark is saying. This is something that's tied to what's going on in the economy.
But Joan, you keep talking about these 160 years as if it's been bad. I mean, hasn't Wisconsin established one of the highest qualities of life in the nation?
Well, I just use that in terms of that we've never had an opportunity to vote on it. That's what I mean, 160 years. Let somebody vote on this. And, you know, we do, let me just bring out a couple points. We do enjoy a great quality of life. But you know what, when you ask the voters this, this has been pitted just so that, you know, groups like ours have known we're not completely off track. This has been pitted against important services. It's been pitted against, you know, social services, education, you know, everything you can think of, and people still strongly support it. People still think that government can live, you know, should be living within some sort of constraint, just as everybody else does.
Well, it's you. I'm sorry, Cheryl, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to go back for 1 second to the question that I had asked about how we get rid of it if it becomes law and we don't like it. No, that's all right.
Sorry.
But I want to make sure that I understood what you said. It has to pass 2 legislative sessions, and then it goes to all of us as voters across the state.
Yes,
Is
and
that
then
right?
it does, and then
And that's to become law.
Well, it becomes part of our Constitution, and then any subsequent changes to the law would have to abide by the new Constitution. That's why it's more strict than just changing the law. But in addition to your question, how would you change it? There's actually a provision in this version of it that allows, you know, if there's something, you know, that really needs to be changed, if you need to change the Constitution just for the cap, it doesn't have to go through 2 subsequent changes. It allows you to only go through 1 change and then go to the ballot. So that's a little bit more of a, you know, makes it a little bit easier to change. It doesn't make it as easy to come up with new legislation, but it makes it easier than, you know, coming up with a complete new change to the Constitution. So I think that was a sort of a middle ground on that.
Sure. Is there anything in the legislation that says that it has to remain on the books for X number of years or X number of months or X number of sessions before we can try to make a change?
No, it does not have, you know, a sunrise or sunset or anything like that. So, no, it's in there.
Well, one of the things, you know, we've been talking about how it's going to impact a lot of us, everyday folks. Maybe you were going to bring this up, Tony, since you work for the university system, but our chancellor, Dr. Richard Wells, he said that based on recent UW system studies and assuming no offset in tuition, the implementation of TPA could result in a 12,513 full-time equivalency student reduction system-wide. And for Oshkosh alone at UW, it would be a 7% reduction of the total. That could have devastating effects here locally too.
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond to that?
Well, I haven't read that particular report, so I don't know, you know, what he's basing his reductions on, or if that's, you know, if that's an official report or what that is. there is a point that I would say, what might end up happening in some of these cases is one of the things that is outside of the cap is tuition, and Wisconsin is probably very low on tuition.
I think
that might end up happening.
I think what he's worried about, Joan, is that, as you said, when something like this goes in place, it forces the government to really prioritize. And he's saying that if TPA becomes law, this is directly from Dr. Wells, I have little reason to believe that UW universities will become a higher priority. He said, in my experience, the best predictor of near future is the recent past. UW has not been treated very well in the recent past. Massive cuts. Under TPA, I don't think they'd be treated any better. That's what he's saying. That the UW already has it fairly bad with this current legislature. It would get worse under TPA, wouldn't it? We could see massive tuition hikes.
I don't think we're going to. I think, again, it's just more scare tactics.
But we've already seen large tuition hikes even without TPA. Don't you think with TPA it would be worse?
I really can't speak to it because I'm not up to speed on what the tuition hikes were. I know we still rank almost at the bottom in terms of Big Ten and in the country. But
well, everyone keeps saying that with every 10 and 20% increase we get. Yeah.
Let me jump in on that, because I do think I know what will happen. As you cut funding from the university, there's only two things that can happen, and probably both will happen. One is that they'll raise tuition. And we're already seeing that people from the bottom 2/5 of the income group are representing a smaller and smaller portion of the college classes, because ordinary working people are being priced out of the university system here. The other possibility is that the universities can reduce the size, the number of students that they serve. And that then crowds out another group of people. That crowds out students who have the capacity to be good college graduates, but whose grades aren't at the very top of their class. It's already reaching the point where you can't get into the University of Wisconsin-Madison without like a 3.8 grade point or something like that. So people will be squeezed out both on income and on economic performance, but in a way that doesn't really match the real world. Kids that are very able to perform well in college will be squeezed out to save money. And I don't think what Wisconsin wants to do is reduce education in the state. That's not a path to success. The other thing, I've got to comment, because you talked about my spending. I want to make a point about spending. My total spending that the board gave me last year went up 2.75%. But $1.8 million of that was a state mandate that the state paid for. So it came in both as income and went out as an expense. If that $1.8 million mandate to move individuals out of the nursing home that were developmentally disabled into group homes, if that hadn't been there, our spending would have only gone up 1.5%. The state spending has gone up 9% year over year for 2 years in a row. And so I think if there is a problem, and I'm not saying that a mechanism like this is the way to go, but if there's any place that it's appropriate, it's at the state level, not at the local level where we've already been thrifty. But all the cuts they've imposed so far, all the structure they've imposed so far, has fallen heaviest on the local governments, the ones that are closest to the people. I think, in truth, there is a need, because people's budgets are under pressure, for us to be very thrifty. But I think we're doing that. We're matching what the people want. I think the layer of government that's not responding as well to the people is the one that's further away and where the people don't have the best understanding. I wish, if the state is determined to do something like this, put financial decisions on autopilot instead of using their good judgment, I wish they would apply it to the state government and get their house in order and figure out what works before they bring something down on the heads of the local government.
Does TPA apply to the state?
Yeah, this applies to the state.
But not just the state.
Not just the state.
No, not just the state, but just a couple points. No, I agree. I said this part of the state's very thrifty, but according to the Taxpayers Alliance, and this is sort of an old number, in general, local government spending in Wisconsin is always in the top 10. It's always about 5th or 6th highest as well. So, I mean, I know this part of the state is very thrifty, and
we do differ from other states in that some of the services provided in the state are provided through local government that in some other states are provided at a state level. So the comparisons are hard. We don't charge our public school students anything. Other states, you might pay a $100 fee, an entry fee, as well as having to pay for all your books a couple $100, as well as fees for participating in music, sports, and that's another aspect of this. You're right, it forces tough decisions, but it also forces people to make anti-family, anti-poor decisions that they would never do on their own directly. The things that the public wouldn't vote to do because they don't agree with the harshness of it will happen because of this mechanism. And that's where it saves money, is it gets us to make decisions that the public would never support if they had to deal with it directly, but where they can turn a blind eye to it if there's some mechanism in place.
What do you say to that?
Well, I don't agree, and part of it is because I've just seen how many. What it's going to do is it's going to force there not to be so many new programs developed. It's going to force there not to be so many expansions of current programs. You're not going to see. The last thing government is going to do is make bad decisions that harm people. The one function of government, is to take care of those most in need. I just don't think that's going to happen. That is not what's going to happen. And back to the university discussion, and the points about the report, if the university makes its case to the legislature, like every other, group or is going to have to make, they can still be allowed increases, under state government. And, it's how well people make their cases for the greatest need. And that's what it's going to force. All of this is going to force what we don't have now. It's going to be forcing looking at government as a whole, looking at these programs, and just making people think twice about spending instead of just, $5 million here, $100 million here, $50 million there. It's going to finally force that type of decision making in the state.
You don't think the UW has made its case?
Well, I don't know. We'll see.
I mean, your group is called Americans for Prosperity. I don't know of any Americans that are against prosperity.
That's true.
But, I'm sure you would agree that the key to prosperity is for having an educated population.
I do agree.
So then why would we risk making it more difficult for people to get their higher education?
Well, I'm just not sure that that's going to be the effect of it. Again,
But it happened in Colorado, didn't it?
Well, this isn't Colorado. That's my point. That's why I hate to compare it to Colorado, because it's so different than Colorado. I think we ought to stick to
but there is a key similarity. In both cases, it was an attempt to amend the state constitution to put constraints on local officials, right, and state officials. That's the similarity.
Well, let me tell you, Colorado also has does and has had one of the strongest, economies in the nation. I mean, I think you're focusing just on kind of what people keep hearing and keep saying, and we don't hear the other side of it.
Well, isn't it usually, Joan, Republicans that support these kinds of things? Usually Republicans almost unanimously support these kinds of constitutional efforts.
I think fiscally responsible individuals.
The reason why I bring that up is because
I would guess if it wasn't so politically partisan right now in the legislature, if we had a little more balance, I bet you'd see a bunch of Democrats.
The reason why I bring that up, Joan, is because in Colorado, when they voted to put the restraint on their Tabor, the Republican governor, Bill Owens, supported that restraint. Mm-hmm. The Tabor people got really mad at him, but he supported that. Brad Young, a Republican from Colorado, has written a book called The Truth About Tabor. Tom Clark was the director of the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. He sounds like a Republican. I don't know if he is or not. They all ended up coming out against it. Isn't that evidence that these kinds of schemes maybe are not the best?
Well, I think that when 70% of the electorate supports some type of restraint on government taxes and spending that we've never had, I just don't think everybody's wrong. Elected officials have lost over this issue, and they're going to continue to lose over this issue because we have a tax revolt in this state. Whether people want to believe it or not, we do. We have a tax revolt going on, and people have lost over this issue.
All right, what about that, Mark? You got into office, right? When you ran for office, you'll find this interesting. When you ran, you were very non-committal about raising the sales tax in Winnebago County. You got into office, you looked at the budget, and literally the first thing you said was, we need a sales tax increase. Well, doesn't that support the side of Joan?
No, and first of all, I was working on the budget and had worked out a rough guidelines with my department heads of what would be allowed. And then the governor signed the levy limitation. And what the levy limitation meant is I had to cut my property tax rate. I cut my property tax rate by 2%. I was required to cut the rate to offset any appreciation in the underlying property. That's when I did that, I needed to look for ways to make up that money. And there was only 2 ways to do it. Laying off employees or finding another source of revenue. And I actually proposed 2 budgets to the county board. One had 40 layoffs. I hate to go back to these numbers, but 40 layoffs, imposed the sales tax, and rebated most of the money to the homeowners that were paying property tax. Or lay off 76 people.
But the board ended up finding the money without the layoffs.
The board took $1.6 million out of the balance sheet. They took money that's only available on a one-time basis. So what they did is they put the problem off for 1 year. We still have to address that problem. And now we're in another year where our revenue is only allowed to grow from property tax about 1.6 million, and we've got a 1.6 million structural deficit. I have not got a single penny available for pay raises, benefits, energy costs, or any new needs, even though I've got new mandates coming from the state.
Yeah.
Well, and I want to talk about mandates because one of the things that Joan had mentioned was, you know, we can't keep adding new programs. But yet one of the problems that I see is that not only are we getting mandates from the state, but we're also getting federal mandates. And while this act would control everything in the state, it doesn't control anything that we'd be getting federally. So how can we keep from adding new programs or keep funding at the same level that we are funding our current programs with these kinds of restraints in place when Washington just keeps sending more and more stuff our way? How do we do that?
Well, I'm not, let me just first of all talk about it on the state level. One thing, and I believe that this does, is, and Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that for any new mandates, it says the state has to fund them. So that's huge. I mean, that is huge. It doesn't address mandates that we have from the state now. It's silent on that. So I think that's a step in the right direction, and that's a huge, huge provision in my view. You know, in terms of federal mandates, I don't know what's an example of a federal mandate that we might be talking about.
Well, if you're talking about things that the federal government funds, I mean, we've just seen the big debate with child support enforcement. So they're still cutting some of those funds, but they're not cutting them in half like they proposed. Where will I make up that money, or do I just not collect child support payments for people? We get $5 to $10 of payments for every dollar we spent collecting them, but the money that was used to employ the people that collect them is being cut. Women, Infant and Children's Program, the nutritional programs for pregnant women and their infants, the federal government's talking about phasing those funds out over 10 years. So the federal government is cutting back on their support for all these programs that they started, and local governments expected to make up the difference. And I'm going to jump to something else for a minute, if you'll permit me. There's also a defect in this that needs to be addressed, and it's with regard to bonds. The way this statute has worked, this is a quirk, I don't think they intended it, but they count the gross amount of money you bring in when you issue a bond issue. Like if Oshkosh wanted to repair a street and was going to cost $500,000, Oshkosh issues bonds to raise $500,000 for their share of the street repair or reconstruction. They would make them count that $500,000 against their limit. And then over the next 10 years, when they pay back that bond with interest, all the money used to pay back that bond would also have to come out of the money subject to limits. So a $500,000 bond would cost them $1.2 million of limits. And quite frankly, there won't be $1.2 million to work with. So if this passes as written today, all street building and street repair will come to a dead halt in this state. And it won't just be the city streets. It'll be all the county's projects too. Now, you're going to say the exception to that, just go to referendum. But do the people in Oshkosh know if AP up in Menasha needs to be rebuilt? Do the people in Menasha know if the bridge over the Rat River in Wolf River needs immediate repair, is in danger of falling?
Well, let's
Well,
ask Joan.
let's ask Joan about that. But just before I let her answer, we've got a screen that I'd like the control room to put up. There are some phone numbers and websites that you can go to get more information. One is for the Americans for Prosperity. That is Joan's organization, and then there is another one, and that is for the it's for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C. There's a phone number for them and a website. So we'll leave that up for a moment so you folks at home can jot that down. But Joan, what about that road thing that Mark was talking about?
Well, you know, he definitely has a point. If I were to guess, I would suspect that that's going to be changed in the final version. You know, and maybe it's not realistic to go to referendum. Obviously, you know, for things like the Marquette interchange, that may not have been possible. You know, so I actually think that there will be some tweaks for that to make it more attractive for local governments. And, you know, obviously our group would like to see a tighter restraint on it, but I think we recognize that, you know, that will probably be made, you know, more flexible.
Talk about Americans for Prosperity. What is
sure.
your organization doing to put this in place? This is a massive lobbying effort, right?
You know, we are doing lobbying on it. I'm doing the lobbying on it. We are actually a grassroots organization in the state. We have about 4,000 members, and our state chapter and the organization as a whole focuses on or supports public policies that support restraining government, and it's the Taxpayer Protection Amendment on a national level. It's, you know, earmark reform, Social Security, and things like that.
You support privatizing Social Security.
Yeah.
Okay. Aren't you putting out radio ads to pressure Republican senators into voting for TPA?
Oh, we are. We're
including
doing
Republican Senator Carol Ressler?
We are doing radio ads. I think they're off the air right now. We're doing mailings, you know, to encourage people to support it, and we will continue to do that, and you might see some more of that in the future.
Okay, Cheryl?
Okay. Well, we're down to about a minute. You know, I guess if you each just want to take a few seconds here and just give kind of a closing thought, and we can get that that one screen back up again so that you've got a good chance to get the address and phone numbers down. Mark, what are your thoughts on this?
30
closing
seconds.
thoughts.
I think the best way to handle this is to give your politicians an idea of what you're willing to spend and what services you want, but be fair about it. Don't expect them to give you more and spend less. That's a formula for disaster, when people tell you you can have everything you want and you don't have to pay for it. So give us a realistic idea. I think they'll find that their board members or city councils are going to be responsive to them. Do they really want a constitutional amendment that puts this on autopilot?
Okay, Joan, very quickly, your
I
closing thoughts.
would just say let the people decide.
That didn't take anywhere near 30 seconds. All right, well, listen, thank you both for being here. It's going to be a while before this would become part of our Constitution anyway, so we'll have lots of time to talk about it, and you guys can get back and forth together again, whatever, and yeah, I'm sure you'll be hearing from your constituents as well. So thanks again to both of you. Tony, thank you. And as always, thanks to you at home for letting us in your home for the last half an hour, whatever it's been here. I'm so used to doing those half-hour shows. We'll see you next time. Until then, take good care and keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.